Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Gracious Hope Live podcast. And it is a pleasure to always be with you here to share this conversation about our country, Liberia. And today we are focusing on rebuilding Liberia's soul. When we're talking about the soul, we are talking about your will, your emotion, your intellect, or your mind, and they all sum up to make up your soul. Every nation stands on three legs. Every nation stands on three legs. One is political, one is economic, but a third leg, the one we talk about least, is called moral. Moral, moral. It is the conscience of a people. And when that moral or conscience breaks, no law, no election, and no police force can hold the other two legs, which are what? Which are the political and the economic, up for so long. And so today's podcast, we are tracing that break in our story as a nation. And in doing so, tracing what happened in our own as well as a people. A freedom proclaimed but never fully shared with everyone becomes a problem. A government office that quietly turned from a trust into a price is a problem. Rich land that never filled the tables to those community members who are close to foreign companies that are raiding concessions to benefit that community or that county becomes a problem if the tables are now full with the benefits. A silence that waited decades before it finally spoke becomes a problem of a nation. So, to our podcast today, we'll also ask about the present situation in our country and ask about hard questions that will make us to think better. For example, can a ballot box really change a heart? Is corruption one bad apple among the others, or a whole orchard grown the same way? And what are we really asking our police to fix when the wound was never on the street corner to begin with? But this is Gracious Hope, and we don't just stop at the wound, but we name it, we talk about it. We'll close the podcast with what it looks like to rebuild a nation's conscience, one covenant, one steward, one honest choice at a time. So I ask you to grab a seat. And this particular podcast is not just looking at Liberia alone. If we look at the history of African countries and any other country, we see people because people make up a nation. So this podcast will be speaking to every heart that is still deciding what it can no longer live with. But here is a simple idea I want to plant in your heart on today's podcast. It's a conversation that I invite you to make comments, and so we can talk about what it is for a nation to have these three legs that I just talked about, which is the political, the economic, and the conscience or the moral, those systems, in order to be a viable nation. And I said, one of the system is the political system that holds power and how it gets passed on from hand to hand. The second is economic, and that is how wealth gets made and how that wealth gets shared out or doesn't get shared out. But there's a third leg, which of course is the one that we talk about it, but we don't take it seriously. And it's very important, even though it is a leg or system that holds the other two up. And that third leg is moral. Like I said initially, it is the conscience of the people, the conscience of the people. And it is what decides what a nation would tolerate and what it will finally refuse to tolerate anymore. You can have a very intelligent or sharp lawyers writing your constitution. You can have skilled hands building your courts and your ministries or cabinet ministries and your markets. But a constitution cannot make you an honest person as a man. A courthouse cannot make you a woman to be kind or generous. That work, the work of building a good conscience, belongs to something older and deeper than any government. And that starts in the family. The family is the first government. And that is what we are going to walk you through today on this podcast using Liberia's story as our mirror. Are you ready? All right. So let's get into it right away, but we'll be right back. All right, and we are back. Okay, so let us start with our nation, give a little background, your history to understand our current situation. We are a nation born with an unfinished question. Liberia's story starts with a beautiful word, freedom, or may I say liberty. Men and women who had known the chains of slavery came to the land and proclaimed liberty. And I don't doubt for one moment that the men, everything they did with their whole heart. That is not a small thing that we can just brush aside. We applaud our effort and do not let anyone tell you otherwise because they have probably good intention to have a country of freedom. That's why the motto, the official motto of Liberia says, the love of liberty brought us here. But here's a hard truth that we have to sit with. The circle of people who were actually welcomed into that freedom or liberty was a lot smaller than the number of people already living on that soil. The indigenous, the communities who had called that land home for generations were not asked to join the new nation as citizens with a voice. They were treated more like subjects to be managed than neighbors to be consulted. Let me just give you a picture here, if you will. A village elder in those early years of Liberia, he watches a scene of new arrivals build towns and courts and legislatures, and they are using the word like rights, liberty, words that elder never had a vote in choosing. Somebody tells that elder, you live in a free country now. We are new arrivals, but now it's a country that is free. But that elder doesn't feel free. He feels washed over. He feels tasked. And every now and then, he feels forced into labor he didn't choose. What he rarely feels is heard. Now, multiply that one elder by every village, every town, every chiefdom that went through the same experience. You start to understand how a promise of liberty that was spoken with real sincerity by some could still land as an insult to others. Something true and something false were both happening at the very same time in the beginning of our founding moment as a nation. And listen, friends, the Bible will not let us treat that lightly. Scripture tells us from the very first pages that every human being carries the image of God in the book of Genesis. The scripture didn't say that some human beings, the scripture says every human being carries the image of God. Every human being equally, no exceptions written in the fine print of the scripture. So when a nation quietly organizes itself so that some people belong fully and others belong only partly, that nation is not just making a political mistake. It is arguing with its own conscience before the ink is written in those founding documents and paper, and before even the ink dried up. Now, somebody listening right now must say, well, Pastor Red, that is just how the 19th century worked everywhere. No young nation back then handled this kind of situation very well. Why single out Liberia? And there's a piece of truth in that particular question if someone to think like that. Other nations build their own houses on cracked moral foundation too. And plenty of them are still paying installments on that very debt right now in their own divisions and their own mistrust. But hear me on this. A partial truth can turn into an excuse if we let it stop the conversation instead of deepening the conversation. Liberia doesn't get to escape its own history by pointing at somebody else's history. And that unsettled question of who belongs did not go away just because time passed. It waited. It waited quietly in the courthouses. It waited quietly in the classrooms. It waited quietly in the church pews until later generations were forced to face what earlier generations had left unfinished. Now, hear me, whether you're a Christian or you're Muslim, hear me here, or of any faith. Naming that inheritance in an honest way is not about shame. I need you to hear that very clearly because so many of us run from the past because we are afraid that facing it means condemning ourselves. No, it doesn't. Naming a wound in an honest way is the first act of healing because nobody can heal a wound that nobody will name out loudly. And that is why, if we look at public office today in our country, in most cases, those public offices stop being a trust and become a prize. In other words, government job is a prize. Now, let us understand that public service is always important. It's good to serve your country because you're rendering service as a servant of the people. And biblically, public office, according to God's design, was always meant to be a form of service. Somebody holds a position so they can serve the people under their care the way a shepherd serves the sheep, not the other way around. But somewhere along the way in Liberia's development, holding a government post stopped meaning I am here to serve you and start meaning my family has arrived. It became a signal of status, a gateway to access, a way to say our bloodline has secured its place, and now our circle of relatives and friends has a claim on whatever resources pass through this office. Could we name that nepotism or patronage system? And once that pattern settles into a culture, you don't even need anyone to enforce it day by day. It just becomes how things are done. Everybody understands it, even though nobody has to say out loud. Let me just paint you a picture here. For example, a young clerk or secretary walks into a ministry or cabinet ministry office for the very first time. He is hopeful, he is idealistic. Maybe he prayed about this job before he took it. And then an older colleague or boss in the same office, meaning no harm, quietly teaches that young clerk or secretary which forms or paperwork to move fast if you know the right people, and which paperwork sit in a drawer somewhere for everybody else. Nobody hands that young clerk or secretary a manual for what is going on there. He learns it the way a child learns the unspoken rules of his household by watching, by repeating until what you feel abnormal starts to feel completely normal. Now, somebody listening must say, isn't that just how bureaucracies work everywhere? Imperfect institutions doing their best. Some people argue that way. And I understand why that answer is so tempting. It excuses everybody and it asks nobody anywhere to change anything. But listen carefully. A public trust that gets treated like private property is not just administrative flaw you fix with a better form or paperwork or a new computer system. It is a moral inheritance, and it will keep getting passed down generation after generation until somebody has the courage to name it and refuse to pass it on one more time. That young clerk or secretary should never have had to learn dishonesty as part of an unspoken curriculum in that office in his first week on the job. And when an entire generation of public servants absorbs that same lesson, we are not looking at a nation with bad luck in this hiring process. We are looking at a nation that has built a pipeline that manufactures the very behavior a leader stands up and condemns. And only a deliberate, sustained, prayerful effort can interrupt a pipeline that strong. And that is why if we look at our country today, we can attest to say, yes, our country is rich with resources. The current president of our country, President Bouaka, when he was elected, he said Liberia is so rich with a lot of resources. But what is the problem? He named the problem that we all say corruption. But corruption does not physically affect people. It comes from the heart. It comes from the home of that civil servant who is serving or working in the public office home. So now, let's talk about our rich land. So rich with resources, with foreign companies agreeing on concessions and leaving the community that is around less. Liberia's land has never been like riches, rubber, timber, iron ore, resources that drew foreign companies from far away, eager to pull value out of our soil long before the ordinary citizen ever saw a fair share of it coming back home. Think about the workers who tap those rubber trees and haul those loads, building fortunes for companies headquartered thousands of miles away, while they themselves lived at a striking distance from the very wealth their own hands were producing. The nation's income went up, But the tables in the villages that are closer to those foreign companies getting those resources, to where that wealth was pulled from the ground, often stay just as empty as before. You could walk through a rubber town near one of those concession areas today and ask an older resident what changed in their grandparents' time. Many of them might tell you about the roads that were built to move product out, not to move people forward, schools that were promised, clinics that were delayed decade after decade, even while trucks loaded with export goods roll past their front doors. Now, if you look in scripture, the prophet Micah gave us that famous call to do justice and to love mercy. And listen, my dear friends, that call was never only about what happens in the courtroom. It was about ledgers that have all of the accounting of what has been extracted from our country. It was about ledgers. It was about wages. It was about land. A nation can grow rich on paper while it grows poorer in conscience at the very same time. And Liberia's history with these concessions with foreign companies teaches us exactly how quietly that happens. Now, it will be easier for you to say, or for someone to say, this is all on those foreign companies. Liberia was just a victim of outside greed with no say of its own. And listen, foreign concessions do carry real responsibility here. I'm not letting them off the hook either, not for 1 second. But our domestic officials signed those agreements. They renewed those contracts. And quietly, some of them benefited from arrangements that left their own people with so little. Blaming outsiders completely lets insiders off far too easily. And that is a truth that is harder to sit with, but we need to sit with it anyway. Wealth without a just distribution for all require cooperation on both sides of the table, the foreign side and a domestic side. That is the officials. Conscience cannot be outsourced to another country's greed. That's why scriptures teach us that stewardship holds a person accountable for what passes through their own two hands, no matter who else in the room is also guilty. Liberia's leaders were stewards of a shared inheritance, the land and everything in it, and stewardship demanded more than too many of them were willing to give generation after generation. And that is why our country still has wounds. Some of those wounds are quiet wounds of being left out. But it can be expressed in a tender way. Long before Liberia's civil conflicts ever broke out into open violence, something had already cracked quietly underneath the surface. Exclusion doesn't always show up with guns and fire. Sometimes exclusion shows up as humiliation in a government office. Sometimes it is suspicion between neighbors from diverse backgrounds. Sometimes it is silence in a room where someone should have spoken up and protested but did not. Each one of those small wounds on its own felt survivable. But add them together decade after decade, and they slowly hollow out any sense that everybody belongs to one shared story. Think about a market woman who gets denied a trading permit, not because she did anything wrong, just because she comes from the wrong region or county and doesn't know the right people, doesn't have the connection. So this market woman adapts. She finds another corner to sell from, another buyer. Life goes on. But something in her trust and without ever meaning to, she teaches her own children that certain doors just are not built for people like them. Here is something worth remembering. A flag or national flag doesn't create belonging. A national anthem doesn't create belonging. Belonging is created by the accumulation of experience of being treated as fully human by our fellow citizens and by the very institutions meant to serve everyone alike. And for far too long, many communities in our homeland, generation after generation, accumulated the opposite experience. And that is a moral debt. And that moral debt didn't just disappear because nobody was collecting it right away. It waited. And now somebody will say, well, Pastor Red, the civil conflict came suddenly. They were provoked by particular leaders with particular grievances in one generation. That deeper history of exclusion, that is only loosely connected. Someone may say that. I understand why. That is an easier story to tell. It puts the fault on a handful of individuals instead of on decades of accumulated hurt or wound. But conflicts of that size rarely erupt out of nothing. They erupt out of grievance that has been building over time, unheard for a very long time, until a spark finally lands on wood that has been drying out for generations. The moral cost of exclusion gets paid quietly for decades before it ever gets paid loudly and violently. We have witnessed violence in our country so much. And recognizing that order of events matters. Not so we can go back and assign blame, but we can understand that belonging, when that belonging is deferred or put away down the line, does not just vanish overnight. It compounds, it adds up like a debt nobody's willing to pay down until the whole nation eventually has to meet that bill together. Listen, we've covered a lot of ground just this half hour. We look at a freedom that was proclaimed initially in the formation of our country, but not fully shared. We look at a public office that turned from a trust into a prize, personal prize. We look at wealth that never made it back to the tables in those poor communities to where it was pulled from the ground, or the resources that were pulled from the ground. And we look at the quiet wound of exclusion that waited patiently until the whole nation had to face it together. If you are hearing your own life in any of this that I'm talking about, maybe not Liberia's story exactly, but a workplace that taught you the unwritten rules to take shortcut, or you've been part of a system that made you feel like certain doors were not built for you, I want you to know that God sees that. He sees every quiet wound, and he is not indifferent to everything that you might experience. So we're going to take a break here, short break, and when we come back, we'll talk about what all of this looks like right now in our country in the present day. And then we'll spend our final stretch talking about hope, HOPE, because this podcast is Gracious Hope. And I will never leave you sitting in a wound that we're all talking about without pointing you directly to healing. So stay tuned. While we take this short break, I want you to have this thought in your mind when we get back. The Apostle Paul told us that a person reaps what they sow. That is true for a man, That is true for a woman, and it is true for a nation like our country, Liberia. So sit with that for a moment. What is being sown right now in our country, in your home, and in your workplace, in your community? Think about those things. We'll be right back because whatever it is, somebody down the line is going to reap it. We'll be right back. Don't go away. All right, and we are back here. If you're just joining us, this is the Gracious Hope Live podcast, and my name is Pastor Red. And this podcast is about talking about mundane maladies that our country faces from time to time. And we are having a conversation here to really understand how we can build our country's soul. The soul has to do with your mind, that is your intellect, your willpower, your courage to do things, and also your emotion, the feelings that you put into it. And that's why we're talking about here. We'd like to say join us as we continue with the second segment of this podcast. And just before we start a second segment, I would like to also let you know that this is my book, and this book is called The Nation's Soul. The Nation's Soul. Let me get on the screen here. All right. It is called The Nation's Soul. The Nation's Soul. Why Liberia's future depends on its moral center. And it is available at malixpublishing.com is where you can get a copy of this book. Go to malixpublishing.com. A Nation's Soul, Why Liberia's Future Depends on Restoring Its Moral Center. And it's selling fast. A lot of people been buying it. We have thousands of copies sold. I have a lot of boxes here I've been sending out. Those who want my autograph, I've been sending it to them in the mail. You get a copy, go to my author's website, which of course it is malixpublishing.com, and get a personal copy for yourself. It's a very good book tracing the history of Liberia and talking about everything that we have to do should be done from the heart if we want for our country to reconcile and also heal and be stable. So there's a lot of not just history, but what can we do, roadmap. And I named about four pillars that we can see as a roadmap to help us regain our consciences to build our country. And so you can get that. So now let's go ahead and continue here with the second segment, final segment of this program. And please don't forget to share this link with your friends, our videos, share it with your friends, and so they can be a part of this program. Okay, so before the break, we walk you through the past, that is Liberia's past, and some of our own past too, if we are willing to be honest with ourselves. And we saw a freedom that wasn't fully shared, a government that started serving status instead of people, a wealth that never reached the tables that needed it, and an exclusion that waited quietly until the whole nation had to answer for it. And we can see all of the violent episodes or events in our nation's history. Now, let's step into the present. And I want to start with a question here that I think every one of us has has asked at some point, whether we are talking about Liberia or whether you're talking about Minnesota, where you have a lot of Liberians, or Rhode Island, or New York, places where you find bulk of Liberian in the diaspora, or even in the UK and other places elsewhere in the world, can voting someone or somebody into office change that person really on the inside? Let me ask that again. Can voting somebody into office change who that person really is on the inside? And that is a question that we have to answer, because glaringly we can see what is going on in our country. Now, don't misunderstand me. Casting a ballot is a real act of citizenship, and I honor every Liberian who has shown up to vote year after year, even after living through conflict and uncertainty that would have made plenty of people give up on the whole process. That courage matters. But here is the plain truth. An election can change who holds an office. It cannot by itself change what that person values, what that person fears, or what that person is willing to do when nobody else is watching. A ballot box can remove a face from power. It cannot remove greed from the heart. It cannot remove favoritism from a mind. It cannot remove the habit of treating public money like personal property. It will be comforting to believe that new leadership alone fixes an old problem, that changing the name on the office door changes the character of the person sitting behind it. So many people have hope exactly that after election day, or after election, only to watch the same old patterns of favoritism and self-dealing show up again under a different name, a different party, and a different banner. But listen, that disappointment doesn't mean democracy has failed. It simply means democracy was never designed to do the job that families, schools, workplaces, and churches were supposed to do first. I want you to take that in. An election tests whether citizens can choose. It does not test and it cannot guarantee whether the person they chose was actually formed with good character before they ever got on that ballot. Now, somebody might ask, or somebody might say, well, then the answer is better vetting of the candidates. Of course, sharper background checks always good. We all would like for people to serve with integrity, straighter qualifications before anybody can even run. Yes, you may suggest that. And sure, those things could help a little around the edges, and I'm not against them. But no screening process on earth can measure a person's conscience with real precision. You know why? Because conscience is not a credential you can put on a resume. Conscience formed slowly over years inside the homes, inside the classrooms, inside the workplaces, and congregations that either taught integrity or failed to teach it. Listen, my friends, a nation cannot vet its way around a formation problem. Liberia, and I'll say this very clearly, and even America too, will keep electing capable, well-spoken, well-credentialed people who still repeat the same old patterns of self-interest until the deeper work, the work of shaping character before a person ever reaches the ballot, gets the same seriousness we currently reserve for campaign season. Because you know, corruption is not just one bad apple. It is easy to picture corruption as one official secretly stuffing cash into his own pocket. That picture is partly true, but it is dangerously incomplete. In real life, corruption is rarely one dramatic theft. It is just a small web, ordinary compromises repeated so often that they stop feeling wrong at all. A little something slipped to move a file faster or paperwork faster, a contract handed to a cousin instead of the person who actually earned it fair and square, a grade, but instead of steady for that grade. A supervisor who looks the other way at theft because he benefits from staying quiet. So you see here, once corruption becomes a system instead of an isolated incident, you don't need villains anymore. You just need ordinary people making ordinary decisions on an ordinary pressure. For example, a teacher who takes a small gift for a passing grade must see herself as simply underpaid, not corrupt. A clerk who inflicts an invoice must see himself as finally getting his fair share after years of being overlooked. On their own, each of those choices can feel almost reasonable, but add them together across a whole generation, and the nation discovers it has quietly built an entire economy of dishonesty running right alongside its official one. And no single arrest is going to dismantle a whole system rooted in the habits of thousands of ordinary people. And now, a popular response says harsher penalties and more anti-corruption commission will finally break that circle. Is that true? Can it happen? And listen, accountability structures matter. Like we have like LAC, we have the anti-corruption commission, which is LAC in our nation. But Liberia needs them working honestly and consistently, and no argument from me about establishing such a commission. But punishment alone deals with the visible transaction while leaving the invisible culture completely untouched. A commission or an anti-corruption commission can prosecute the one official who took the bribe. It cannot by itself change a classroom where cheating went uncorrected. It cannot change the home where dishonesty was modeled as being clever. It cannot change the market stall where shortchanging a customer became just another Tuesday. Corruption as a system requires a remedy that runs through every institution at once. And that is why formation is important. Formation of conscience, not just a courtroom waiting at the far end of the line for the unlucky few who happen to be cut or get cut. And that is why when survival presses down on our consciences, then it becomes a problem. So now here is something very tender, and I want us to slow down as I talk about this. Poverty doesn't just limit what a family can buy at the marketplace. It narrows what a family, when they feel it has the freedom to refuse. If we take a look at a young man selling cell phone cards and small goods, let's say at a checkpoint, he watches the officer wave through the vehicle after a driver slips a little something into that outstretched hand. He doesn't admire what he's washing, but he needs money that same evening for food on the table. And if the economy around him never opens a better doorway, eventually he might find himself doing something similar just to survive for the week. It will be easy to condemn that young man and stop him right there. But that response misses the deeper failure. When an economy leaves too many people with no honest path to their daily bread, it doesn't just produce poverty. it produces pressure, and that pressure wears down a person's conscience one small transaction at a time. And when every institution that failed to build him a better road shares in that outcome. Now, somebody, and I understand the instinct that someone listening would say, a hungry person still has a choice. Poverty explains dishonesty. It doesn't excuse it. Yeah, someone might say that, and there's a real truth in that, and I want to protect it because dignity requires holding people responsible for their choices rather than treating them like they have no agency at all. But listen, that truth turns cruel the moment it is spoken by somebody who has never had to choose between an honest wage that doesn't exist and a dishonest shortcut that does. I said it before we had our first break, and I'll say it again because it belongs to what we are talking about here on this podcast. And if we look in the scripture, the Apostle Paul's teaching that a person reaps what they sow applies to nations just as much as it applies to individuals. A nation that sows decades of limited, honest opportunity should not be shocked when it reaps a harvest of compromised conscience among its own whole field. Not only to the ones who happen to be standing close to that situation, that is to the checkpoint or wherever it is when the moment came. But when that happens, and we see a society over time going down the drain of decay when it comes to that, when it comes to conscience and doing the wrong thing, then we want the police to arrest. The police to arrest the young people. I was looking at some statistics the other day, and in 2024 to 2025, most people that they arrested were young people. What we are asking the police to do, by the time a young person reaches a police station in handcuffs, a long chain of earlier failures has usually already taken place. Somewhere behind that moment sits a home where nobody modeled honesty, a classroom where nobody addressed the cheating for grades, a workplace where nobody paid a fair wage, a congregation where nobody asked the hard questions. Now, the police officer standing at the desk did not create any of that history for that young person that was arrested. He simply inherited it, along with the impossible job of controlling behavior that should have been shaped years earlier of that young man in the home. So this is a quiet tragedy sitting at the center of so much of our laws in the country when it comes to enforcement struggle, law enforcement struggle. And at the center of ours is what we see every day. We see police officers. All right. And so, no police department, however well trained, however well funded, can retroactively raise a child, mend a broken marriage, or plant a conscience that was never developed in a home in the first place. And that is why our police, they overworked because they expect them, when they arrest young people, to do the job by handcuff the young man and put him in jail. And we see that over and over. Young men sleeping in the streets, young men on drugs, they are arrested. But there's a history. And that is why When the nation asks its police to do what only families, what only schools, what only workplaces, and the faith communities can do, it is not really asking for law enforcement. It is asking for a miracle. Then it turns around and blames the officer when a miracle doesn't show up. So now you see the easiest response to a rise in crime in our country is always people say more officers. That's how to respond to a rise in crime. More patrols, more checkpoints, stiffer sentences in our court system. Those steps might bring a little short-term order. And yes, a functioning society does need capable law enforcement, but I'm not saying the opposite. Treating policing as a primary solution mistakes the symptom for the disease. More officers can slow the bleeding. They cannot heal the wound because that wound was never located in the street corner to begin with. It was located years earlier in the homes, in the classroom, in the workplaces that quietly failed a young person long before that young man ever failed the law. And that is a reality. So if we look in our churches today, we turn, or most people turn there for hope. And like I told you from the start of this podcast, I will never leave you sitting in a wound without pointing you toward the healing. So let's spend our last stretch together here talking about what building something better could actually look like. First, Liberia and every nation listening and every heart listening to the broadcast right now needs more than new laws. It needs a shared understanding that rights and duties always travel together, that freedom without accountability eventually consumes itself from the inside out. And if we look at our country, where every school child is taught that citizenship is not just the right to vote or the right to protect, it is a covenant, a two-sided promise, the same kind of promise we see at the heart of the biblical story, where blessing and responsibility were never handed out separately from one another. A citizen of Liberia who understands freedom that way stops only asking what the nation owes him or her and starts asking what he or she owes the nation in return. Just multiply that shift of mindset across the millions of our people, and it will do more to stabilize our republic than any single policy could ever manage. And you know why? Because a covenant lives in the conscience of a people, and conscience outlasts every administration that ever takes office. Second, every major decision a nation makes, whether it is political or economic, should have to answer one simple recurring question. And that question is, what will this do to human dignity, or to family stability, or to community trust? What would it do to the common good? And that is not naive to ask. That is not naive idealism. That is a practical filter. And it is a filter that can expose decisions that enrich a narrow circle while quietly damaging the wider society those very decision makers swore to serve. An investment that only enriches a few people while leaving everyone around them poor, sicker, and more distrustful is not really growth at all. It is extraction wearing the costume of development. Third, leadership has to be understood as stewardship, not inheritance, and definitely not reward or a prize. Public office is a temporary trust placed in somebody else's hand, and it's all meant to be handed back in better condition than it was received. Let us remember that steward in the ancient parables in the Bible, it was something good that Jesus talked about so that people could get the understanding of real life situations through the story. He was never praised for how much he managed to claim for himself. He was praised for how faithfully he managed what belonged to somebody else. And I'm talking about the parable that Jesus said about the steward, where the master gave them money to invest, and the one who invested it came with plenty, or he came with more, and the master applauded him for that. But the other people, some of them, they dug holes, and some of them use it in a way that was not wise. That's a parable I'm talking about. And that is a fair, and that is a far healthier picture of leadership than status or personal enrichment could ever offer us. And that is how we can multiply as individuals, as a group, as a community, to create stability and peace and growth. Fourth, a nation needs to measure more than its wounds. Crime statistics and employment numbers matter also, but they only tell half of the story. They have that shows up after something has already broken. A wiser approach also measures the conditions that prevent the breaking in the first place. And that is why family stability is important, school attendance is important, honest workplace practices important, public trust important, how the most vulnerable people among us are actually treated is important. A country that only counts its wounds will always be surprised by how deep they run. A country that also counts its strengths can start building on them deliberately, one community at a time. Our time is running out here. So I want to leave you here today, and I want you to really hear this one, okay? None of what we just talked about or what I just talked about for this whole hour begin at the police station, and none of it will be solved at the police station. Every bribe, every grade in his school bunked instead of earned, every privilege that quietly inherited into a government office, all of it traces backward to a conscience that was never properly formed in the home, in the schools, in the workplaces, in the church, or the mosque, and it rolls forward onto a burden no single police officer, no single leader, no single law can carry alone. A nation doesn't first collapse at a police station or in a courthouse or on the training floor. It collapses in the conscience. And the collapse eventually reaches every institution standing in that nation, one after another, until somebody, some family, some church, some community decides to start building the conscience back up. That somebody could be you, and that family could be yours. That congregation could be the one you are sitting in right now, or that you're a member of, or the one that you're leading, or the one you are praying about starting. So I'll leave you here on the podcast today. Make your comments, and of course, share this video with your friends, your families, and loved ones. And this is how we end today. And I will once again like to say, get a copy of my book, A Nation's Soul: Why Liberia's Future Depends on Restoring its Moral Center. You can find it at malixpublishing.com. Go there and get a copy, and you will love it. Thank you so much. And this is how we leave you today. May God bless you, and may you have a great day, or great night, or great morning, or great afternoon, wherever you are. May you have a great time. Bye for now. We'll talk to you again, and may God richly bless you as you spend the day with your friends, your families, and your loved ones. Okay, then. Bye for now. Bye.